began to understand, as much as it frightened me to understand. I began to understand how someone could pick up a rock and throw it at a tank. I began to understand how someone could hurl a bottle at a soldier. I began to understand why someone could strap dynamite to their body and blow up a bus. When you have nothing, when you're left with nothing, when you're stripped of everything, including your identity, why not strike back? Now, I need to be clear. The vast majority of Palestinians do not believe in violence. Yes, Hamas has used violence in the past and may use it in the future. Fatah has used violence. Terrible things have been done in the fight for land and freedom, especially given the incompetence, infighting, and corruption of much of the Palestinian leadership. But hear me when I say this. The vast majority of Palestinians hope and pray that some kind of peace will be brokered that will give them a scrap of land and a fragment of dignity. Even as I speak, there are Palestinians and Israelis and internationals hard at work teaching the nonviolent resistance of Gandhi and King, teaching the path of peace in refugee camps and villages, teaching peace in the streets of Nazareth, Nablus, Hebron, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. I've met them, and I bow before these courageous women and men. I stand humbled in the face of their conviction that nonviolent resistance will eventually touch the conscience of Israel and bring freedom and justice to Palestine, just as it did in India, just as it did in the 60s in the South, just as it did in South Africa so very few years ago. But in that twisted, that tormented land, I found myself looking at the human rights workers, looking at the peace activists as naive dreamers. Pick up a gun and fight for yourself and your family, I found myself thinking. Defend yourself and your land by any means possible. Now, as a minister who teaches and preaches peace, I was being confronted with the limitations of my own compassion. I was being confronted with the limitations of my own Unitarian Universalist faith. Could I be strong enough to walk the path of peace if I lived in that place? Israel and Palestine awakened an unknown part of myself that believed violence was justified. Could vengeance be mine? On my last day in Palestine, I joined a small group that was heading towards the Palestinian village of Beileen, deep in the occupied territory. Each Friday, for the past 5 years, the villagers hold a peaceful protest against the Israeli occupation. And so we marched out beyond the village to where that wall cuts across the fields. 2 kids in motorized wheelchairs led the way to the barbed wire, cement, and steel. I went there because I wanted to believe again. I wanted to rekindle my hope through the hope of those around me. I wanted my humanity renewed by the humanity of those marching and working for justice. The protest began peacefully. We marched, we chanted slogans, we waved signs. Then there was a slight provocation from the Palestinian side. A few young people hoisted a protest sign up and over the first perimeter of the wall. Israeli soldiers hidden behind riot gear moved towards us. A loud boom echoed and expanded. Someone yelled or screamed, I can't tell which. There was another boom as the soldiers began to fire tear gas at us, canister after canister of poison and power. As the gas exploded around us, some Palestinians picked up stones. These skinny, shirtless 13 and 14-year-old kids grabbed pieces of their homeland and hurled it at the soldiers. The cycle of violence was rekindled and reborn. Two peoples who have each known great wrongs again began their battle. Tear gas was shot, stones were thrown, army against civilians, armor against skin, great power against great determination. How is this anyone's promised land? Standing there in that hope-filled and hopeless crowd, I cried. I cried because the tear gas burned in my eyes and nose and throat. It hurts. But my true tears were for these two peoples, Arab and Jew. My tears were for the Palestinians who live day after day in an unjust and ignored occupation. My tears were for the Israeli soldiers, boys and girls really, just out of high school, scared, unsure, and turned into pawns in a political minefield. My tears were for my country, the United States of America, for funding the subjugation of a people and not even talking honestly about it. My tears were for the Jewish settler I'd met a few days earlier who couldn't understand why I couldn't understand that the Palestinians brought this all upon themselves. My tears were for the old Palestinian woman who grabbed my hands, looked in my blurry, bloodshot eyes, and said, "When the Jews came home, they made us homeless." And finally, my tears were for myself, so full of anger and desperate to feel hope and forgiveness.